The shocking clash between Jung's psychology and Buddha's wisdom. Buddha's journey. What if the very thing you have been told to build, protect, and cherish, the self, is nothing more than a fragile illusion? What if the entire foundation of modern psychology, with its emphasis on strengthening identity and integrating personality, directly clashes with one of the oldest spiritual teachings in the world? The Buddha's radical insight of anatta, the doctrine of no self. At the heart of this clash lies a profound human problem. We all suffer from confusion about who we truly are. Carl Jung, the great depth psychologist, believed healing comes from embracing and integrating the unconscious into a stronger, unified self. The Buddha, on the other hand, taught that clinging to the idea of I is the very root of suffering, and true freedom comes only from dissolving the illusion of self entirely. Here we stand, torn between two paths, one telling us to find ourselves, the other urging us to lose ourselves. Which is true? Which leads to freedom? This book-length journey explores the shocking confrontation between these two visions of human existence. We will not just analyze ideas, we will uncover the life and death implications for our struggles with anxiety, depression, trauma, emptiness, and meaning. In today's world where people feel both over-identified with their egos yet empty at their core, the question of self versus no self is more urgent than ever. We will travel through the landscapes of Jung's psychology and Buddha's wisdom, tracing their origins, principles, and practices. We will see where they clash, where they converge, and how this tension can become a doorway to transformation. Most importantly, we will face the ultimate problem. Can human beings live meaningfully while letting go of the very self they cling to? Or do we risk falling into nihilism without an ego to stand on? The birth of the self and its illusions. The Western journey of the self begins with the rise of modern psychology, a field that sought to understand the hidden forces shaping human thought, emotion, and behavior. And at its foundation lies the question of the I, the conscious sense of identity that defines who we believe we are. And perhaps no two figures have shaped this inquiry more than Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, whose theories still echo in the way modern people view themselves, their struggles, and their path toward healing. Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, introduced the radical idea that beneath the surface of our conscious awareness lies a vast unconscious, filled with repressed desires, childhood traumas, and forbidden instincts. And he saw the ego as a mediator between the instinctual drives of the id and the demands of reality and morality represented by the superego. In Freud's view, the self was not a harmonious whole, but a fragile construction precariously balancing competing forces, constantly threatened by anxiety, repression, and neurosis. And therapy was aimed at making the unconscious conscious, so the ego could navigate reality with less inner conflict. Jung, originally Freud's disciple, eventually broke away because he saw Freud's model as too narrow, too focused on sexuality and pathology, missing the deeper spiritual and symbolic dimensions of the psyche. Jung introduced a vision of the psyche that expanded far beyond the individual, proposing that the unconscious was not merely personal but collective, containing archetypes, primordial images, and patterns that shape human experience across cultures and history. Where Freud emphasized repression and neurosis, Jung emphasized meaning, symbolism, and the quest for wholeness. And here begins the Western journey of the self as a transcendent goal. For Jung, the psyche is composed of several key elements: the ego, the conscious sense of identity, the personal unconscious, holding forgotten or repressed material unique to each person, and the collective unconscious, a vast reservoir of archetypes that manifest in myths, dreams, and symbols. Within this architecture, Jung highlighted several crucial figures. The shadow represents the disowned parts of ourselves, the qualities we deny or repress because they conflict with our conscious identity, yet which exert a powerful influence from beneath awareness. The anima and animus represent the inner opposite gender, the feminine image within a man and the masculine image within a woman, shaping our relationships and our creativity. Finally, the self with a capital S is the archetype of wholeness, the organizing principle of the psyche, the center and circumference that encompasses both conscious and unconscious. For Jung, individuation, The process of becoming whole by integrating these elements was the central task of life, a spiritual and psychological journey of reconciling opposites, confronting the shadow, embracing the inner other, and realizing the self. Unlike Freud, who saw the ego as besieged by unconscious drives, Jung saw the ego as a necessary but limited part of a much greater totality. And the path of healing was not merely managing conflict, but aligning with the self, which he viewed as both a psychological reality and a transcendent mystery. Why did Jung see wholeness as salvation? Because he observed that many of the sufferings of modern people, neurosis, despair, emptiness, anxiety, arose from fragmentation, from being split between conscious identity and unconscious forces, from repressing shadow aspects, from living without connection to deeper meaning. He believed that when people encounter dreams, myths, and symbols, they are given messages from the self, guiding them toward greater integration. Salvation for Jung was not in denying or erasing the self, but in deepening and expanding it, recognizing that the ego is not the master of the house, but a servant of a greater self. To become whole meant to live in balance with both light and shadow, to acknowledge instinct and spirit, to bring unconscious material into consciousness so one could live more authentically, creatively, and meaningfully. Jung often compared this process to alchemy, where base matter is transformed into gold, a metaphor for the transformation of the fragmented psyche into wholeness. Yet while Jung was articulating a vision of wholeness in Europe, centuries earlier in India, a radically different perspective had emerged, one that saw the very notion of self not as salvation, but as the root of suffering. The Buddha's revolutionary discovery of no self, or anatta, stands as one of the most startling insights in human thought. In the Buddha's time, the prevailing religious and philosophical systems of India emphasized Atman, the eternal self or soul, believed to be identical with Brahman, the ultimate reality. Liberation was often described as realizing this eternal self, but the Buddha, through his profound meditative insight, denied the existence of such a permanent self. He observed that what we call the self is nothing more than a collection of five aggregates: form, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness, all impermanent, all subject to change, all lacking inherent essence. Clinging to the belief in a fixed self, he taught, is the root of dukkha, suffering because we attach to something that cannot endure. The doctrine of anatta does not mean that we do not exist in any sense, but rather that the self as we ordinarily conceive it, solid, permanent, independent, is an illusion. Like a flame that arises dependent on fuel, or a chariot that exists only as a combination of its parts, the self is a dependent process, not a separate essence. For the Buddha, liberation comes not from building or integrating the self, but from seeing through the illusion of self, loosening the grasping that binds us to craving, aversion, and ignorance. Nirvana, the extinguishing of suffering, arises when the illusion of I and mine is dissolved, when one no longer clings to identity, but flows with impermanence and interdependence. Here lies the shocking clash. For Jung, the task is to build, integrate, and realize the self, while for the Buddha, the task is to dismantle the very idea of self. One seeks salvation in wholeness of self, the other in freedom from self. Jung's self-archetype is a transcendent center that guides us toward harmony, while the Buddha's anatta is a radical deconstruction of all centers, pointing toward emptiness as liberation. Jung's psychology offers a path for modern individuals struggling with fragmentation, alienation, and loss of meaning by calling them to embrace all parts of themselves and find unity. Buddhism offers a path for those bound by clinging and illusion, by calling them to let go of the very notion of self and taste freedom beyond ego. Why then do modern humans feel both inflated and empty? Because we live in a tension between these two visions. On one hand, modern culture tells us to assert and build our identities, to brand ourselves, to strengthen our egos, to define who we are with clarity and pride. On the other hand, many feel that this project is hollow, that no matter how much they build, they feel an inner void, a gnawing sense of unreality, as if the self they construct is fragile and false. We oscillate between self-inflation, believing in our uniqueness, power, and autonomy, and self-emptiness, feeling lost, meaningless, and disconnected. From Jung's perspective, this emptiness comes from lack of integration, from ignoring the shadow and deeper self, while from the Buddha's perspective, it comes from clinging to an illusion, investing in a self that cannot be real. The human problem is that we try to make permanent what is impermanent, to solidify what is fluid, to control what cannot be controlled, and this struggle leaves us both overburdened with ego and hollow inside. Thus, the birth of the self in Western psychology and its deconstruction in Buddhist wisdom confront us with a paradox. Do we need to strengthen and realize the self, or do we need to see through and release it? The answer to this question defines not only the course of therapy or meditation, but the very meaning of human existence. Jung's call is to become whole. The Buddha's call is to wake up from the illusion of wholeness. Between these two calls lies the crisis of modern humanity, a crisis of identity that manifests in our anxieties, our addictions, our search for meaning, and our inability to feel at home in the world. Matseku, the clash between Jung and the Buddha. The clash between Jung's psychology and the Buddha's wisdom becomes most vivid not in abstract theory, but in the raw realities of modern human suffering, where individuals struggle with anxiety, trauma, and identity crises that gnaw at their sense of stability and meaning. And it is here that both Jung's vision of individuation and the Buddha's doctrine of no-self offer profoundly different interpretations and prescriptions. Consider the case of anxiety, one of the most pervasive afflictions of our time, where individuals find themselves gripped by fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of not being enough, and fear of annihilation itself. And through the Jungian lens, anxiety often arises from a conflict between conscious identity and unconscious material, a tension between the ego and the shadow, or between the ego and deeper archetypal forces that have been repressed, ignored, or denied, so that the psyche cries out for integration. For example, a perfectionist professional who suffers panic attacks may discover in Jungian analysis that beneath her rigid self-image of competence lies a terrified inner child, a shadow of vulnerability and inadequacy she has never embraced. And Jung would say that healing lies in encountering this shadow, integrating it into her conscious identity, and allowing her ego to be reshaped by a more authentic and whole relationship with the self. The anxiety is not simply an enemy to be eliminated, but a messenger pointing to a deeper imbalance. And individuation is the process of listening to this message and realigning with the self, thereby transforming fear into growth. Through the Buddhist lens, however, anxiety has a different root. Clinging to a self-image, clinging to permanence in a world of impermanence, clinging to control in a reality that cannot be controlled. And the professional's panic arises not because of repressed unconscious material, but because she identifies with a fragile self-concept that cannot withstand life's inevitable changes. When the sense of "I must be competent" collides with failure or uncertainty, suffering arises because the illusion of a solid self is threatened. For the Buddha, the solution is not to integrate the shadow into a larger self, but to see through the illusion of self altogether, recognizing that thoughts, feelings, and identities are impermanent processes rather than fixed realities. Mindfulness practice helps her observe panic as a passing phenomenon, to see fear without clinging to "I am afraid," but simply noting fear is present, and liberation comes not from strengthening the ego, but from dissolving attachment to it. Consider trauma, another widespread affliction in modern life, where individuals are haunted by past wounds that refuse to heal, where the psyche is shattered by violence, abuse, or catastrophe. Jung would approach trauma as a fragmentation of the psyche, a rupture where unbearable experiences are split off into the unconscious, forming complexes that intrude into life through flashbacks, nightmares, and compulsions. And he would emphasize that healing requires integrating these split-off fragments into consciousness, acknowledging the shadow of pain, and gradually reweaving the psyche into a more unified whole. Individuation in trauma work means making space for the wounded child, the terrified victim, or the enraged avenger within the self, allowing them to be seen, heard, and symbolized through dreams, art, and therapeutic dialogue. And as these fragments are embraced, the person becomes more whole, more authentic, and more resilient. Buddhism interprets trauma differently as the extreme intensification of clinging and aversion, where the mind grasps at "I was harmed, I was violated," and clings to painful memories as if they are permanent marks of identity. The sense of "I am my trauma" perpetuates suffering, and liberation requires loosening this identification, observing memories and sensations as impermanent aggregates rather than as me or mine. Mindfulness and compassion practices help the traumatized person observe pain without being consumed by it, to see that the self who suffered is not a fixed essence, but a passing configuration, and that freedom lies in releasing the grip of identity. Where Jung seeks to integrate trauma into a stronger, more coherent self, Buddhism seeks to dismantle the identification with trauma as self, dissolving the very center around which suffering crystallizes. Identity crisis provides another vivid arena for comparison, where individuals question who they are, what their life means, and what role they play in the world. In Jungian psychology, identity crisis is a symptom of the ego being cut off from the deeper self, and individuation requires confronting the shadow, engaging with archetypal images, and opening to the transcendent center of the psyche. For example, a midlife crisis might arise when a man realizes that his carefully constructed persona of success and control hides an unacknowledged vulnerability, a neglected creativity, or a longing for meaning. And Jung would say that the crisis is the self calling him to integration, urging him to go beyond the mask of ego toward wholeness. Dreams may confront him with images of death and rebirth, urging transformation, and healing lies in listening to these symbolic messages, confronting unconscious material, and allowing the ego to be reshaped by the self. For the Buddha, however, identity crisis is the inevitable outcome of clinging to the illusion of self, because the harder we try to define who I am, the more we suffer from the instability of that definition. The midlife crisis man suffers because he clings to "I am successful, I am powerful," and when these identities falter, he feels lost. But in Buddhist terms, this very loss is an opportunity to realize that the self is never stable to begin with. The practice is not to build a new identity, but to release identification altogether, to see that "I" is just a label for changing aggregates. Liberation is found not in redefining the self, but in transcending the need for a self-definition. At this point, the tension becomes sharp. Jung heals through integration and individuation, building a stronger, more authentic self aligned with the archetype of wholeness, while the Buddha heals through detachment and liberation, dismantling the illusion of self to end clinging. Jung calls us to wholeness, the Buddha to emptiness. Jung calls us to become ourselves fully, the Buddha to see through ourselves entirely. Yet despite this clash, there are intriguing points of convergence. Jung's shadow work resonates with Buddhist mindfulness, in that both require facing what is usually avoided. The shadow is what the ego rejects, while in mindfulness, one observes thoughts and emotions without clinging or aversion, allowing unconscious material to surface without judgment. Both processes demand courage, honesty, and willingness to encounter discomfort. Similarly, Jung's archetypes and the Buddha's emptiness both point to realities beyond the ego. Archetypes represent transpersonal patterns that shape human life across cultures, suggesting that the ego is not sovereign but embedded in a larger psychic reality, while emptiness points to the interdependent, non-self nature of all phenomena, suggesting that the ego is not sovereign but dependent and illusory. Both frameworks challenge the ego's supremacy and invite us to look beyond the narrow "I." But here lies their irreconcilable divergence. For Jung, archetypes ultimately guide the individual toward the realization of the self, a transcendent wholeness that still affirms being, while for the Buddha, emptiness points toward the dissolution of self altogether, denying any permanent essence or transcendent self. Jung would say that without the self, the psyche collapses into chaos and fragmentation, while the Buddha would say that clinging to the self, even a transcendent, archetypal self, perpetuates illusion and suffering. Jung's path culminates in integration, the harmonization of opposites into a unified whole, while the Buddha's path culminates in nirvana, the cessation of grasping at any whole at all. This leads to the central problem. Can we survive without an ego, or does clinging to ego destroy us? From Jung's standpoint, the ego is necessary, for without a conscious center to navigate reality, we would be overwhelmed by unconscious forces, fragmented and lost. And his clinical experience showed that patients who tried to dissolve the ego without first strengthening it often fell into psychosis or confusion. To Jung, the danger of Buddhism, misunderstood, is that people may attempt to annihilate the ego prematurely, mistaking pathology for enlightenment. And he insisted that the task is not to abolish the ego, but to integrate it into the larger self. From the Buddhist standpoint, however, the danger lies in clinging to the ego as real, for this perpetuates craving, aversion, and ignorance, the roots of suffering. For the Buddha, we can indeed live without ego in the ultimate sense, because what we call ego is only a convention, a useful designation for practical functioning. But liberation means no longer mistaking it for ultimate reality. The challenge is that we must use the convention of ego without believing in it as essence. Modern humans are caught between these poles. On the one hand, without some sense of ego, functioning collapses, and we cannot navigate relationships, responsibilities, or even daily life. On the other hand, when we cling to ego as real, we fall into anxiety, trauma, and identity crises that gnaw at us endlessly. The clash between Jung and the Buddha exposes this paradox with shocking clarity. Jung insists we must build the house of self before we can inhabit life meaningfully, while the Buddha insists we must see that the house has no foundation if we are to be free from suffering. The question is not easily resolved, but it forces us to confront the deepest tension of existence. Do we need to be someone, or do we need to let go of being anyone at all? Fortune, beyond the clash, towards inner freedom. The attempt to move beyond the clash between Jung's psychology and the Buddha's wisdom has taken many forms. As thinkers, therapists, and practitioners in the modern world have sought to bring together these seemingly opposing visions in search of a path that speaks to both the need for psychological health and the yearning for spiritual liberation. And one of the most striking areas of synthesis has been found in the work of Jungians, who studied Buddhism, and Buddhist psychologists who turned to the tools of Western depth psychology. Carl Jung himself engaged with Eastern thought, but he remained cautious, warning that Eastern teachings of no self could be dangerous if taken literally by Westerners whose egos were not yet sufficiently developed. And yet some of his students and successors explored these connections more deeply. Jungians such as John Welwood, Mark Epstein, and others have written extensively about the dialogue between psychotherapy and Buddhist practice, suggesting that individuation and meditation may be complementary rather than mutually exclusive. John Welwood coined the term spiritual bypassing to describe the danger of using spiritual practices, including Buddhist meditation, to avoid unresolved psychological wounds, pointing out that seekers often mistake detachment for enlightenment when in fact they are suppressing shadow material that needs to be integrated. And in this insight, we see how Jung's emphasis on shadow work can serve as a corrective to misapplications of Buddhist detachment. Mark Epstein, trained both as a psychotherapist and a Buddhist practitioner, has argued that meditation and psychotherapy together offer a unique opportunity to understand the nature of the self and its illusions, where therapy provides the tools to face and integrate unconscious material, while meditation offers the direct experience of impermanence and no self. And in this way, the clash becomes less a contradiction and more a dialogue where each path compensates for the limitations of the other. Buddhist psychologists and mindfulness-based therapies have further advanced this synthesis, most notably through practices like mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR, developed by Jon Kabat-Zinn, which draws directly from Buddhist meditation, but frames it in secular terms for the healing of anxiety, stress, and chronic pain. While not overtly Jungian, such therapies resonate with his belief in the transformative power of symbols and inner awareness, and they show how Buddhist insights can be applied in a modern psychological context without requiring adherence to Buddhist metaphysics. At the same time, Jungian analysts who incorporate Buddhist meditation practices often emphasize that the experience of emptiness and impermanence can enrich individuation by preventing the ego from inflating itself as the sole center of meaning, grounding the journey toward wholeness in a deeper humility. Thus, attempts at synthesis reveal that Jung's vision of integration and the Buddha's vision of liberation need not be seen as mutually exclusive, but can instead be seen as two aspects of a larger human quest to understand and transcend suffering. When we turn to the practical paths of individuation and meditation, we see more clearly how each changes the mind in profoundly different ways. Individuation is the process of becoming whole, of integrating the conscious and unconscious parts of the psyche, of confronting the shadow, embracing the anima or animus, and realizing the archetype of the self. And through this process, the ego is expanded, enriched, and transformed into a more authentic center of life. The individual comes to feel connected to deeper layers of meaning, guided by symbolic dreams and archetypal imagery, and the mind becomes more resilient, more creative, more integrated. Individuation is not about dissolving the ego, but about putting it into right relationship with the greater self, a process that requires patience, courage, and a willingness to face the unknown within. Meditation, in contrast, is the practice of observing the flow of thoughts, sensations, and feelings without clinging or aversion, cultivating mindfulness and insight into the impermanence and non-self nature of all phenomena. And through this practice, the mind gradually loosens its identification with ego, no longer grasping at I and mine, but instead seeing experience as a dynamic process of arising and passing away. The mind becomes calmer, more spacious, less reactive, and less bound by craving. And the transformation lies not in integrating unconscious material, but in realizing that both conscious and unconscious are empty of inherent self. Where individuation strengthens and integrates, meditation loosens and dissolves, and together they represent two powerful but divergent methods of transformation. Yet in the enthusiasm for synthesis, there are risks of misunderstanding both sides, and these risks must be acknowledged. One risk is spiritual bypassing, where individuals use Buddhist teachings of no self or detachment as a way of avoiding unresolved psychological issues. For example, someone with deep childhood trauma may retreat into meditation to escape pain, convincing themselves that they are letting go of ego when in fact they are dissociating from their wounded parts. And instead of liberation, they reinforce repression, mistaking numbness for enlightenment. Jung's psychology warns us that the shadow cannot be bypassed, that unconscious material must be faced and integrated, and that skipping this work in the name of spirituality leads to one-sidedness and stagnation. Another risk is psychological inflation, where individuals immersed in Jungian psychology become enamored with archetypes in the process of individuation, inflating the ego by identifying with the self or with archetypal figures, mistaking symbolic experiences for ultimate reality. And this danger mirrors what Buddhism critiques as attachment to subtle forms of selfhood. For example, someone may have a profound dream of uniting with a divine figure and conclude that they have realized their true self, becoming inflated with a sense of spiritual superiority, when in fact they are clinging to a new identity. Buddhist insight into emptiness serves as a corrective here, reminding us that even the most exalted experiences are impermanent and not to be clung to. Thus, both traditions provide safeguards against the pitfalls of the other, and the dialogue between them becomes not only fruitful, but necessary. Stories of transformation illustrate how seekers caught between self and no self navigate this tension in lived experience. Consider a man who enters Jungian therapy to deal with depression, discovering through dream analysis that he has repressed his creativity and passion under a persona of rational control. And as he integrates these parts of himself, he begins to feel more alive, more whole, more authentic. Yet after years of therapy, he still feels restless, sensing that even his expanded sense of self remains fragile. And so he turns to Buddhist meditation, where he experiences directly the impermanence of all phenomena, including his cherished self, and in moments of deep silence, he feels a liberation beyond any identity. His journey illustrates that individuation and meditation can be complementary, with therapy providing the ground of integration and meditation opening the door to liberation. Consider also a woman who enters a Buddhist sangha seeking peace from anxiety, immersing herself in mindfulness and detachment. And at first she feels great relief, but gradually she realizes that her avoidance of anger and grief is not true liberation, but suppression, and her teacher directs her to explore therapy. In Jungian analysis, she encounters the shadow she has been bypassing, embracing her pain and integrating it into her life story. And only then does her meditation deepen into a genuine freedom not built on repression. These stories show that seekers often move between the poles of self and no self, finding healing not in choosing one path exclusively, but in allowing both to illuminate different aspects of the human condition. This brings us to the final resolution. Is freedom found in integration, in dissolution, or in transcending both? Jung would say that freedom lies in integration, in becoming whole, in realizing the self that unites all opposites, and that to dissolve the self is to fall into emptiness that risks nihilism. The Buddha would say that freedom lies in dissolution, in seeing through the illusion of self and releasing clinging, and that to integrate the self is to perpetuate bondage. Yet perhaps the deeper resolution lies not in choosing between integration and dissolution, but in transcending the very dichotomy. The modern human journey may require us to integrate enough to be whole and stable, and then to dissolve enough to be free from clinging. And in this way, freedom is not found in self or no self alone, but in the dynamic interplay between them. To be someone and to see through someone, to embrace the shadow and to let go of identity, to realize the self and to realize anatta, may both be necessary stages of a larger awakening. Freedom then is not merely psychological health, nor merely spiritual liberation, but a new way of being that honors both integration and emptiness without clinging to either. In conclusion, the modern human journey is not about choosing sides between Jung and the Buddha, between self and no self, but about awakening to a way of being that holds both truths in tension and transcends them. We need Jung's vision of individuation to confront our shadows, to integrate our wounds, to become authentic and whole. For without this work, the pursuit of no self risks bypassing and repression. We need the Buddha's vision of anatta to release clinging, to see through the illusions of identity, to taste the freedom beyond ego. For without this insight, the pursuit of wholeness risks inflation and attachment. The awakening of our age may be to realize that the clash itself is the doorway, that the tension between self and no self is not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived, and that true inner freedom comes when we stop clinging to either side and open to the vastness beyond. In this awakening, we no longer ask whether we must build the self or dismantle it, but instead we discover a freedom that embraces both building and dismantling, both integration and dissolution. And in this freedom, we find the courage to live fully human lives, whole yet empty, grounded yet free, selves that know they are not selves, a paradox that is not a contradiction, but the very essence of liberation.